Right. Welcome back to the Bridge Podcast. This is episode 55. I'm your host, John Lamberton. Today I'm joined by my guest, Louis Nielson. Louis is a composer, an educator, and an activist. He's got a history teaching composition over at Oberlin. He's currently at or entering some teaching at Manhattan School of Music. That's correct?
That's correct.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining me. Looking forward to talking to you. So as you know, I sort of start off the conversations asking people about their coffee preferences or their coffee habits. It just gives me a particular sort of insight into their personality. Can you share any coffee habits that you have?
Kind of depends where I am. I'm very partial to Italian espresso because the crema is much richer. When I don't really know where I'm going, I tend to drink Americano. So I think I consider that to be on the safe side, but God only knows if that's the truth. But I like dark roasts, especially Sumatra or Ethiopian, not so much Yirgacheffe. But I do like dark roast coffee. I like to drink it black. Don't like sugar because I like the taste. And I don't drink it obsessively, like 10 cups a day, but I do like to start my day with a nice solid jolt.
So in terms of like, maybe a few servings, like in terms of ounceage, I guess it sort of changes with espresso versus Americanos, but
Yeah.
you aren't super crazy about your consumption, but are you a conservative drinker? Are you moderate or reasonable in your consumption?
It depends. I can be tempted with coffee. I mean, if I'm sitting in a coffee shop, I mean, it's kind of like, if you go to the barber shop, you'll get a haircut eventually. If I'm in a coffee shop, I'll get another cup. I mean, if it's really good, especially if I'm in Italy or if I'm in France, I'm very likely to just hang out and probably just get wired. But
it's funny. I feel like some people, such as myself, or more successfully David Lynch, like really depend on coffee for inspiration. Do you feel like you could get by creatively without it, or is it integral to being a creative individual?
never thought about it, but I've really never tried. I tend to have my habit of getting up, drinking coffee, and off and running. I don't think that's really ever varied very much.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, I got some insight into your coffee drinking. Thank you for that. So, I guess to just start, you are, I think, a very well-respected educator in composition, and I've sort of been wondering, how do you evaluate the quality of somebody's compositional technique or sort of what they're doing without being influenced by stylistic concerns? Like, how do you sort of take a non-biased look at what they're doing under the hood and try to help them?
In teaching, to a very great extent, I'm teaching people who are rarely older than their, say, late teens to mid to later 20s.
Okay.
And I think, especially in the United States, it's going a little bit far to expect people to come in with obvious talent that you can tell right off the bat that this person is absolutely terrific. If they've got a very large musical background, like a lot of the Chinese students I have, that could be a little bit different because their musical background is going to be much broader. But I don't tend to make too many judgments right off the bat, mainly because the acquisition of compositional technique, learning, both historical practices, but also getting to the point where you're really starting to see what you really want to do is a process of discovery that's usually going to take for most students longer than their 20s. So it's not that I don't expect people to be very good coming in, but I have to be very careful not to have too many expectations on the front end, because how they develop and what they learn from, how well they learn, how well they listen, how well I listen, is a relationship that gets developed over a certain period of time. I feel most able to maybe take a look or a judgment or be able to sort of see a trajectory at the end of someone's work with me, for example. But you don't always know. You don't always know who's really going to be successful. And successful not necessarily defined as, you know, getting that great job or getting into the movie business and making a lot of money, but actually showing that they've got an ability to expand whatever field they're working in. It's not something I really try to evaluate. My job is to sort of help people gain the experience and the background that they need, and also develop technique in general, but also the technique that's most appropriate for them, because technique is both broad and communal, but it's also individual.
Mhm.
And that's my job, is to sort of help people not make, you know, help them to avoid mistakes possibly, but also to help people see, you know, when pressing on something might be the very much the right thing to do, even if it's maybe the more difficult thing or the less likely to be executed thing.
Do you think that having a student whose technique or just like kind of their capabilities is like pretty impressive, is that a more difficult position to be put in as a teacher?
Not at all. I love teaching students who have a capacity to learn a great deal, but also bring a great deal to the table. I've had some students like that at Oberlin. It wasn't difficult. It was just really fantastic. My relations with them, I think, continue to this day, and I really enjoy and look forward to seeing what they're doing. That's when the conversation can become extremely rich, and the things, you know, my job is to sort of help them have the courage to do what they really want to do. Because once you've acquired good technique, once you've really got an image and a vision of what you want to do, a lot of times it's a question of having the courage to really follow through it and do it and follow through to the maximum extent. We live in a rather constrained world where, you know, time limits are given to both recitals in particular institutions or in competitions or so forth. And that doesn't encourage people to really stretch out, reach the limits of what they can do, find those limits so that the next time out, they're able to do more, go further still. It's wonderful to have students like that. Absolutely. Those are lessons that when you're knocking at the door because the teacher isn't done with the previous lesson, those are those lessons. The ones that just keep going because there's so much to say and so much to discuss.
So with composition, you know, it strikes me that there's like a lot of it these days is kind of for practical purposes, or kind of, you know, like film scoring or like video game music. But then there's like this kind of other special composition, which I think is what you're interested in, what I'm interested in, where it's like, I think it's taken a place in a sort of academic realm now. I don't know that it's fundamentally academic, but I'm curious how you see composition within that sort of realm, where it's like composition for the sake of composition. It's not to support visual storytelling in a movie. It's not to like have background music. It's not for entertainment, but specifically like a kind of design or artistic thing. How do you think about that?
Actually, academies are increasingly wanting to develop and are funding and supporting commercial music, and music for consumption, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
That's true in performances, but especially in composition, because that is, you know, we live in America. America is a place where money equates value.
Mm-hmm.
This is the land of, you get what you pay for, and the more you pay, the more you have a right to expect, or the more you believe the quality might be. So what is academic is increasingly what's fueling the film industry, what's fueling video games and so forth. And of course, that can be done well or badly or conventionally. The challenge there academically is to get people to do stuff that is nominally original, but not so original that it starts to really dominate, say, something that's visual or something else.
Mm-hmm.
That's a skill in and of itself. And I've taught students who want to get into that world. I'm not sure how great I am at that, but I've certainly done it. Um, the world of what you might call serious concert music composition is a much more narrow world. There are quite a few people who are interested in it, but I think it's also a world that, in terms of the United States, it's become an increasingly smaller niche market in a
Hmm.
way, and it's the property of only really the top rank of schools, and not all of them. For example, at Manhattan School, most of the students there, I think, are primarily interested in becoming serious music composers, um, and developing their skills in kind of the classical sense. Although there are some, of course, that are interested in making some kind of career in the commercial world.
Hmm.
But I think that I have, as a teacher, it's my job to be prepared to move in whatever direction that I can. And I think I've done. Um, I think I've been successful in both ways. My preference, of course, is to teach the craft that I essentially practice myself, because for one thing, it's less uniform, and it really does involve creating a relationship between somebody who's trying to express their individuality in the context of something that does have a communal background, but at the same time, they really want to be able to find a means of expression that belongs to them, discovering what that might be, and discovering where they have really, I don't tell them, but they have to see within themselves whether they possess the talent to really pursue something like that.
Hmm.
That's much more of a challenge, and much more enriching, I think, for a teacher. And hopefully it's also enriching for the student as well. It's but on the other hand, there are rewards in talking over orchestrational details, instrumentational details when it comes to appropriate means of film scoring and stuff and things like that. I don't enjoy it as much as a teacher, but it's something that I mean, I don't have a great deal of respect for the respected names of film scoring. I have to say
Hmm.
that, because the voice leading is usually pretty crappy, and
Yeah.
and the fact is that John Williams is just basically ripping off Richard Strauss right and left. And if Richard Strauss hadn't been dead as long as he'd been dead, then we'd be talking lawsuits at the yin yang.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But it's that's but still the one thing you can say about John Williams is he has mastered that approach.
Hmm.
Um, and if he hadn't mastered that approach, as a lot of people who imitate him have not, then it stands out pretty strongly, and it's pretty clear that it's kind of second-rate John Williams, which is like 10th-rate Richard Strauss. And I can help people not be 10th-rate Richard Strauss, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, I suppose with somebody like John Williams as well, they also have like a whole community of like minions that are like doing the grunt work of their
Well,
notation.
it's a team. I mean, the name Hans Zimmer as a composer is actually a firm.
Hmm.
And a lot of these guys, they'll scroll out something on a piece of paper, and it goes to the team, harmonize it, and then the other team orchestrates it, and then it goes through, and the guy says, no, I want this, I want 50 tubas here, not the balance string section or whatever.
Hmm.
They're going to decide. I've heard some stories from studio musicians in LA that just either make me sick or just make me die laughing, one or the other,
Yeah.
of what people want and what they actually execute. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's a team sport, very definitely a team sport.
I was curious sort of how you think about where we are in the compositional world in terms of like instrumentation, because the standard sort of like composition or composer will like typically have to go for a collection of like acoustic instruments or maybe orchestral, and then like people start incorporating tapes or live electronics, or eventually you're going to see some like electric guitars. How important do you think it is to hang on to those standard instruments, and how important do you think it is to sort of push into more like Maximus P purely synthetic territory? Because I mean, you can say they're both important, but I feel like for me, I've always sort of tried to move on from standard instruments, and I should probably value them more. So I'm open to either perspective.
Well, I take the approach. I mean, part of my compositional education was being around a lot of percussionists. And percussion as an instrument, what isn't percussion? I got a printer sitting over here. That's percussion. I got my coffee mug. That's a percussion instrument. I've got a piece of paper. Anything could be a percussion instrument. A violin can be a percussion instrument. And if you think as a percussionist would think, then essentially what an instrument is a sound factory that produces certain things. When we talk about the violin, for example, the general thought about the violin is it's a sound factory that's been defined by the practice of the 18th, 19th, and 19th centuries to a large extent. But it's actually a factory that can produce a great many more things than that. It can produce them in the context of an entirely acoustic situation. It can also produce them with interesting modifications when amplified, and amplified in certain ways. It doesn't have to be bowed with a bow with hair on it. There are other things that can be done. I'm sort of sufficiently, I sort of take my love of animals into the realm of musical instruments. And I don't want to do anything that would harm a musical instrument because I love musical instruments.
Yeah.
But I think part of I don't really see I don't see this as sort of an either or situation, but rather just a kind of a worldview where a percussionist would look at a violin as a potential sound source that you have to put in a particular setup in order to access it and make the sounds that particular piece is calling for. Violinists, of course, are taught a technique that's really built around what happened maybe in early music. You're doing a lot of Bach. If you're more of a 19th century guy, you're looking at, I don't know, Vieuxtemps and a lot of kind of hokey Paganini kind of concerti that really are kind of sickening musically, but really are great, stunt type things. But also the rich vibrato and all that kind of thing. But the violin can produce many more things like that. So I see it as a continuum. I don't really see it as as something that's fenced off. I think what you do with the instruments contextualizes them in one way or another, and you can contextualize them electronically, but you can also take things and work entirely acoustically, which to me is much more intimate. I mean, if you're going to have sex with somebody, you don't, obviously you can do it with stuff with all the pornography that's available, but it's a little bit more intimate when there's another person in the room and you're actually two people having sex. And really in a concert, it's not that different. I think that the intimacy of people going to see people actually, sweating it out, producing a piece of music, it's a different kind of experience. With electrical instruments, that's a different kind of ambiance. It's just simply a different context. So I see the world as being much more expanded in that regard. But I think like a percussionist. I don't think like, okay, this is a violin, I've got to do this on it. A remarkable experience I had, which I think maybe contrasts what a lot of people expect. A friend of mine is Helmut Lachenmann, the German composer. And I went to the recording session that he did with the Jack Quartet for Reigenseliger Geister in Bonn. And there was a sound that he was looking for. And Chris Otto, the first violinist, says, "Oh, you mean this sound?" Now he was using a completely different technique than what was notated in the score. It was not the technique. And certain quartets, I'm going to do what's notated in the score. They don't care what Lachenmann says. But Lachenmann said, "No, that's the sound I want." So that's the sound they used on that recording at that moment. So it's the sound that's important. That's a perfect example of just sort of looking at any instrument as part of a resource that you just simply take advantage of the perfect resource. You've got a machine that can do two different things and you didn't know it could do that second thing. Hey, use it for that second thing if you can. And not, because it's the sound that's important, not necessarily the exact descriptor of the technique.
There's a video that I saw of you, I think it was from like an Oberlin promotional thing, and you're talking about, how like electronics aren't that crazy to see with the guitar, but then, when somebody puts their hands inside the piano and plays the inside, it's kind of a new performance technology. And you mentioned Lachenmann, who my awareness of his some of his compositions is that he kind of puts strings together to create like a giant string instrument, as if it like collects the ensemble into one hyper instrument. And so I'm curious if this notion of a hyper instrument, whether it's like multiple instruments acting as one unit, or sort of extensions of normal instruments, if this is something that you think about at all.
Well, Helmut's an orchestra composer primarily. I mean, most of his works, certainly his famous works, are for fairly large orchestras. I don't really have that luxury because I'm not a big fan of the orchestra in general. I've written pieces for orchestra, but I don't have a lot of confidence in that medium. I think some of that's maybe more political than it is necessarily musical, because I really admire Lachenmann's orchestra music incredibly, but it's not something I necessarily go to. As a hyper instrument, I'm really not so sure. If you're talking about sort of composite sounds and a kind of orchestration of something that's going to sort of ultimately arrive at a new sound, yeah, I'm interested in those things. But I think I'm also, in the context of the music that I write, I tend to sort of work, I guess, more as much individually as I do in terms of some kind of hyper instrument. And also, I don't write for forces of that scope. And like I say, I think like a percussionist, and with a percussionist, anything, it's all right there. You've got that sound right there that you can produce. I like the challenge of getting in unusual sounds, and there might be some mimicry. But for example, musical mimicry in the past would be like something that's canonic or fugal. But imitation in the realm of timbre is something that can produce something that's, I think, like what you're talking about, like a hyper instrument, where a sound that might be produced on a bowed instrument using a very, very light, perhaps a sort of really kind of a friction type of sound, is something that can then develop into a wind instrument, which can develop into something that's percussive. And so there's this sense of timbral composition that can result in sonorities that can become thematic, to some extent thematic.
Gotcha.
I don't really, I don't really set out to create an instrument with necessarily globally from within the whole ensemble, although to some extent, I see it, the larger ensemble works I've done is kind of like a machine I'm setting in motion sometimes. But there are other aspects in what I do that there's an awful lot of what I've been done lately is built out of text, and the supremacy of the text and methods of dealing with the text lifts it away from that realm, which is another major difference between what Lachenmann does with text and what I do. I want the text to be there, and I have the text I choose have a very definite purpose, whereas his also have a very definite purpose, but the recognizability is part of creating that hyper instrument you're talking about, which I don't tend to do that much. I don't really, that's not really my focus. The comprehension of the text is extremely important to me in a way that I don't think is quite as essential. It's more in the background for Lachenmann.
You mentioned that you don't write much for orchestra, and that's always been a medium that has not really interested me either. Like I used to play trombone, like a symphony orchestra when I was a kid, and that was fun and stuff. But thinking about it today, it's kind of like, it seems gluttonous almost, because it's like, how many strings do you have? Like, it's like just the sort of expense that must go into facilitating that type of ensemble. To me, like, it sort of like pushes my like, this is unethical button. I'm curious if that resonates with you. And I mean, like, should people be focusing more on sort of small chamber ensembles more, and should is a strong word, but instead of these big sort of like ensembles that just must cost loads of money to fund?
Well, as a knee-jerk idea at most institutions is that you've got to write a thesis, and it's got to be for orchestra, and basically has to be for the orchestra that has existed for a couple hundred years. And that's kind of a very American academic way of thinking. In Europe, there's a much more fluid approach. I mean, Lachenmann's orchestral music is not played in the US, it's played all over Europe. And a lot of that's because of the way it's funded. So money definitely enters the picture. From the ethical standpoint, in America, I totally agree with what you're suggesting about the ethics of that kind of working. If you are dealing with flexibly with it, however, then the expense is actually worth it, because you can deploy all these forces and use them in some extremely creative ways that we simply don't do in this country.
Mhm.
Some schools used to do it. I'm not sure if anybody does it anymore. At the academic level, and if not at the academic level, it doesn't get done at all. But I think, the orchestra in the United States, and increasingly in Western Europe, is a function of what you can afford to have it do. I mean, if you just look at the way they're set up, especially regional orchestras with their relatively small cores, and the expense of, adding a third wind instrument and having more than a timpanist play, it restricts what can be played or what's going to be commissioned. And it just becomes a political nightmare, and fosters incompetence, I think, amongst the musicians. I heard a performance by an orchestra, which I probably shouldn't name, but it's one of the top orchestras in this country. It was a performance of Notation of Boulez. It was terrible. It was pathetic. They were using people who were supposed to be good percussionists, and they were terrible. It was a monstrosity. And this is a top quality orchestra. I'm talking Philadelphia orchestra level, not the Philadelphia orchestra, but that level of orchestra. It was pathetic. And if the thing is, a European grouping hearing that would be just revolted by it. But that's perfectly acceptable here, because we don't put in the money, we don't put in the time, and we're not interested in experimentation. People don't know the difference. They do not really have a particularly educated audience for that kind of music. For them, the Rite of Spring, which, God, is 100 years old, I mean, that's early music, for God's sake. That's adventuresome for an American audience. And if somebody's a bar off, they're not going to know that either. If they're 15 bars off, as I think they were at least in this Boulez performance, nobody's going to know that either. And maybe the conductor doesn't even know. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I mean, with Boulez, or like so much of this modern music, it seems like it is getting to this level of complexity where, like, I don't know that the instrumentalist can really keep up with what the like, I feel like it's like, like hacking and security, like you can't really keep up with the hackers from a security standpoint. So like composers are going to be doing crazier and crazier things, and like eventually, what are you going to do as an instrumentalist? Do you agree that there's a sort of tendency towards increasing complexity, and do you think that it will eventually have to top out? I mean, you would say that it did with like Steve Reich or something, but it seems like stuff is just getting more and more difficult to play. Yeah.
I think there's a couple of things that I think keep things going, at least. There's certain things that I don't feel a great affinity with, but composers have always put performers under pressure. And so pressure is part of being a performer. The pressure on the composer is to be able to reach, or to give enough meaning that the performer wants to reach that level. The orchestra, for me, is not really the best place to do that, unless you have the reputation and the money to really support the rather large amount of rehearsal time that's really required to do it. So chamber music, I think, is where the complexity really takes place, and that's where you're going to hear probably the most complicated types of things. I mean, Ferneyhouse, for example, is a chamber composer, and that music is extremely complicated, but it is also, that's the medium that can be executed. And a lot of performers, at least from the ego standpoint, really want to rise to that occasion. They want to rise to meet it. If it's rewarding enough, if the musical product is rewarding enough, then I think also that's going to generate the interest. My music is not necessarily that complicated, but I put performers under a lot of pressure by the other things I ask them to do, like sing and so forth. And some people don't like to do that at all, but some do. And I've been very fortunate in my career to have worked with some extremely talented young musicians who adore challenges and like to be asked to do things that are out of the ordinary, like to do things that really articulate themselves, that give them an opportunity to be expressive in more ways. I think that will always be the case. I think there'll always be that sort of cutting edge where you're going to find people who really want to rise to that challenge. And works that sort of stand out. I mean, Lachenmann's Pression is an example of something that I don't think he would tell you that that's one of his favorite works of his own. But cellists really say, you know, if I'm going to play in this, I need to master this piece. I've got to learn that piece. It's sort of a Bach cello suite of in the present. And that's something that, and that's complex. Technically, it's complex. It's very complicated to only make the sounds that are notated in the score, even just to get the bow in the right position to make those sounds. So I think there's complexity of all kinds. The rhythmic and pitch complexity, you know, I think there certainly are limits to what people are going to be able to execute. And I think a lot of composers who write music that is extremely complicated, maybe, I don't know what their expectations necessarily are, but I think it kind of varies from person to person. I've made demands that I think, you know, did they realize everything I wanted? Probably not. Could I determine exactly that they have or have not? Not necessarily, but I'm not really sure that that's entirely the most important consideration anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of it comes down to the motivation of what that complexity is supposed to produce, and you know what lies behind it. If it's simply to be complicated, and if it's simply to challenge the ego of a performer, you know, I think that's I'm not sure that that's particularly good motivation. But if there's something richer that lies behind it, then I think that's rather different.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, for example, Xenakis is a composer who has written some extremely complicated pieces, but I mean, people tend to sort of get submerged in the music formel aspects of Xenakis, and they don't necessarily see the poetic side, especially in his later music. I don't think they understand Xenakis's notion of poetry and poetics.
Mm-hmm. Xenakis's book, I believe Formal Music. I never remember the exact title because it's kind of nondescript, but I feel like that's, you know, an incredible resource for composers, and like especially for modern composers who are like interested in, you know, applying discrete math and all this type of stuff. I'm curious if you can point me toward a few sort of fundamental compositional resources, whether they're books or lectures or you know, even like the correspondences that you did with Lachenmann. Like, what are some particularly enriching resources for composers?
I think this is going to, I don't know if it articulates my age or whatnot, but as a compositional resource, there's a lot of interesting things to look at, but unless one has the historical perspective to place it in, the resource value is really kind of difficult to say. When Lachenmann writes about his sort of 3 principles of composition, they're extremely rich and complicated, and are written by a guy who's in his 70s, now 80s. And unless one is really in that context as a resource to somebody else, it's not, you don't really get the richness of it. I was talking to him once about dialectics, and he said, look, the most important thing for a resource for a composer is to ask the question, can you make a good piano reduction of the Brahms Requiem? Because I mean, to him, it really comes down to technique. And it comes down to history. It comes down to really have an understanding of that history. I mean, this is a guy who can tell you in Mahler's symphonies how long it takes to go from Stuttgart to anywhere in Europe, because that's what he'll listen to Mahler's symphonies as he's traveling. It can tell you how many it takes and where you end what movement of what symphony. Mm-hmm. Because I think the historical background is extremely important. As resources, I don't know. There's a lot of stuff that's been written, and a lot of stuff that's been written about practice. I'm not saying that composers don't tell the truth, but I think the truth often lies in not so much in what they might, it looks like they're prescribing, but really the background that led up to that. When you know that Xenakis, for example, that his background as an architect and everything he the crucible of his ideas is sort of founded on mathematics and architecture and various concepts there, as much as whatever his musical background, which is by no means as slight as people make it out to be. I think that can sort of change your perspective, because that the background that feeds into that and the desires that feed into that, I think are extremely important. So I don't really have any recommendations. I mean, there's tons of stuff to read, and I think one of the problems that can be had in accessing those resources, you get the frosting, but the cake that underneath it is something that can be kind of missing. So I don't really have recommendations in that regard. It's like when Lachenmann went to wherever he goes and calls himself Santa Claus in reverse. You know, Santa Claus brings you gifts. I'm taking all of your gifts away. You can't use any of those things. Those techniques for flute and violin, they don't belong to you. They don't, so I'm taking them all away. You have to do something else. And that's really, you have to, he arrived at that point, and all those sounds, of course, are available, but the context of what got him to the point of exploring those sounds, that's something everybody has to discover, I think, from the inside out. That's where the background in compositional technique, I think, becomes extremely important. I mean, if I were going to say what's a good compositional resource for people, I'm going to say the study of counterpoint. I mean, the study of what's rational and sort of building from the rational into the category of what if is something that's your compositional lifetime. I love to read works by Pierre Schaeffer, who was a really crappy composer. And also his compositional ideas are really kind of stupid. And he basically ruined a whole generation of French composers at the Groupe de Recherche Musicale with his Traité des Objets Musicaux. But that's okay. It's still fascinating to look at it. But you know, it leads you kind of down the garden path a little bit. So I'm very wary of too many things. I think those things are kind of fun reads to leave to your old age, maybe. As prescriptions, even if they're not snake oil, they can turn to snake oil real quick.
So in the pursuit of technique, like I've always considered myself to be somebody who like really values technique. And I think that there's I mean, whether as a performer, as a composer, but like there's a certain type of person who hears technique and they, I think, equate it to like one showing off. And so they'll sort of write it off and be like, well, technique isn't everything. But I think that it kind of is everything. And when you look at it a little bit more closely, it's like technique is a vast space and has a lot of sort of subcategories to it. So I'm curious, if somebody was pursuing compositional technique, what sort of like, how would you reduce it to some more manageable aspects of technique, if that makes sense?
Well, I mean, the way I explain it to people is that, you know, the study of historical practices and techniques this is not so you get to be a really good writer of fugue or whatever, but these are the barbells you lift to get stronger. So when you become like in an athletic situation, you know, I ran competitively for a while, and I hated workouts at the track. I mean, I really hated it, but I did them religiously because that's how you get faster. And you know, sometimes you really feel you reap the benefits of all that work, and sometimes you're right on the border of injury and you get injured. But I mean, nevertheless, you know, the technical aspects of that kind of preparation really leads on to some good things. I think if technique for its own sake, that can sort of become, as you say, a kind of a stale, you know, what a good boy am I kind of composer, what a good girl am I kind of composer. But I think that when technique is looked at appropriately and dealt with appropriately, then it leads to questions of what if. For example, you're going along and you get kind of stale and you think, well, I'm kind of just basically working the levers and relying on my technique, but I'm not really thinking about this stuff. Technique, when it becomes stale, if you ask the question, well, what if I don't do this? What if I do something else? And it can lead in a lot of different directions. I mean, in Bach, for example, if you analyze some of the verticalities in Bach, they don't make any sense. They violate every rule in the book. Brahms had a huge collection of parallel fifths and octaves of Bach. Bach didn't care about that stuff, not that much. There are places in Bach where you look at what's lining up and you're thinking, God, you know, if a student of mine did that, they'd be 10 points off on this assignment. But Bach stretched those limits. He didn't live constantly with those limits. He wrote some very ordinary fugues. There's some really ordinary fugues in the Well-Tempered Clavier. They're just, you know, they're nice, but, you know, just because they have the Bach name on it, I mean, you know, there's some kind of Campbell's tomato soup in there. It's not great. I mean, it's not going to kill you. It's okay, but it's not his best effort. He would be probably the first person to say, yeah, well, you know, I don't like this key. It doesn't work very well. Even it doesn't sound really in tune to me on the clavier. So the hell with it. But so, I mean, there are times when everybody works the levers a little bit, but technique also leads you. If technique is not a box that you live in, but a way to open doors into other avenues, then it works out very well. I had a remarkable experience. Maybe about, I don't know, 24 years ago, 25 years, no, not that much, maybe 17 or 16 years ago, where I was writing something. It was going nice. It was a commission. It was cooking along. And I just got, what am I doing here? You know, yeah, it's developing, it's moving. And I just sort of asked myself, you know, this voice in the back of my head, what would happen if the cellist just put down her instrument and started singing a song? What if she just said, screw this, I'm not doing this anymore. I want to do this. And, you know, the voice inside me said, okay, you know, you had too much coffee today. Don't make a decision. But it kept coming back to me. And eventually I said, you know, what have I got to lose? You know, and also this was a challenge to my technique. Now, I'm not saying everybody can do it or everybody ought to do that. But, you know, the piece had gone, it wasn't stale. It was just sort of, you know, grinding things out, and it was going to make a nice sausage that people could eat. But, you know, I wanted to do something else. I didn't want to just do the same old thing. And that's without a grasp of technique, without recognizing where my technique was leading me. I would have not accepted that challenge. And I'm not saying the piece works that everybody necessarily likes it or whatever, but it was a very important thing for me to accept that challenge and to realize that the challenge was there for me to do. Without working out things technically, without having that technical grasp, I think the piece would have just, you know, it would have kind of petered out, and it would have been okay. And, you know, people would have said it was interesting. But I don't want to be interesting. I want to provoke. Interesting leaves the audience exactly the way they were when they walked in, and I don't want to do that. I don't want the audience to leave a concert if they're leaving a little perplexed, that's probably good. And I'd like to have some things that they find hard to accept. But I'd also like to have done the technical means to make it feasible, and rational. Not to say they've got to agree with me, but that I want to at least lay the foundations to do some things where those challenges will work out. And I don't want to be predictable. I mean, that's the other thing. The technique, understanding of technique and where technique can lead you is very important, because you avoid predictability that way. People who lack technique often keep recomposing the same thing. And there's a lot of well-known composers who really are pretty much recomposing, doing a great deal of recomposition and not really developing anything new and different, or not moving in a different direction.
So you need technique as the sort of tool to explore the new territory, to keep things from being stale.
That's how talent grows. I think that the really talented people I know follow that. They follow their the inspiration comes from what you have gathered technically, but also where your imagination kind of meets it. Another piece I did a long time ago, my inspiration, if you want to call it that, was I was imagining the audience kind of chained to their chairs with the floor being heated so their feet were burning and they were beaten with whips. And I wanted to, for some reason, I was mad at the audience. This was a time when I was writing off my electrical bill. I was writing off my prorated portion of the electrical bill in the state I was living in because I was not supporting capital punishment and I wasn't going to pay for their electric chair. So I decided I wanted to get the audience out. It's kind of contradictory. I wanted to kill the audience and get my revenge that way. But eventually, what that led to was, I had to ask myself, well, you're not going to do that. I don't want to go to prison for torturing the audience, but how can I place the audience under that kind of stress? What sonically can I do to do that? And I'm not saying the solution I came up with was achieve anything quite that extreme, but it led to me asking technical questions I would not have asked otherwise, and looking for solutions I would never have looked for otherwise, to create a distorted musical context that would really, at least for myself at that time period, create a degree of stress, discomfort, but not ugly, just discomfort. There's plenty of sounds that are extremely aggressive and assertive that create discomfort, but are by no means ugly.
Mm-hmm. This piece sounds like it should be performed alongside that Jason Eckhart piece that has visuals that use like enhanced interrogation techniques or whatever.
Oh, his rendition, yeah. We did that on a concert I did once, yeah.
Nice. You mentioned counterpoint when we were talking about technique, and I'm curious who you think some of the best exemplars of contemporary counterpoint are. It seems to have taken on a different meaning than when people talk about species counterpoint and all that.
It definitely has. I think that's a tough one. Mainly because I think I've got to kind of go back and think about it in a way that is perhaps more geared to timbre and than it is to other things, because the primary components in classical counterpoint is basically pitch and rhythm. But now I think it's going to evolve coloristic transformations. And one of the things that can happen is textures can become so homogenized, counterpoint kind of gets lost. One guy who I think does a really good job is James Dillon. I think, and like the Sody Waste is a piece that has really good counterpoint in it. A lot of his music is sort of seeking counterpoint. He sort of rejects the complexity label, and I think one of the reasons he does is because he's genuinely interested in creating the sense of contrast and oppositions in color, especially that recreates counterpoint. So I like what he does a good bit. Obviously, I'm a big fan of Helmut Lachenmann, and I think he's somebody who's also quite capable of making counterpoint. I think some of his solo music actually is contrapuntal in the same sense that one refers to the Bach solo pieces as containing counterpoint, but it's on a timbral level as much as maybe more than anything else. I could probably expand this list in a very wide way. If I thought about it with a little bit more depth. Some of my former students, I think, do very, very well with this. Very, very well with creating different layers. One question I ask myself technically is, what's the difference between composition that exists in a wide variety of layers and something that's contrapuntal? Because there can be differences. And how do we analyze those layers? For example, in music I particularly like, there's for example, there may be a pitch layer and a pitch architecture that you can trace throughout the piece, but it is contrasted by layers that perhaps have to do with tone color manipulations that may be working in a very, very different manner than what's happening in the pitch world. So there are two different structures going on at the same time. Is that counterpoint? Perhaps counterpoint is the basis technically through which you arrive at something like that. But in and of itself, it's not really counterpoint.
Mm-hmm.
But counterpoint is sort of in a background structure to me in that. And I think technically from that standpoint, you can expand the world, that world quite a bit in terms in talking about composers. But I'm not sure. I mean, I'd mostly be mentioning names of composers whose music I particularly admire, but it would probably be far too limited a list because I think counterpoint is far from lost, but I think it's expanded into a more structural zone than it used to be. Like, you know, when you talk about species counterpoint or 18th century style or 16th century style counterpoint, you're talking about usually pretty microscopic things, especially in species counterpoint. That's really counterpoint under a microscope. But if you expand it into greater structural things and what counterpoint really means, and you see this in Bach too, where you take a measure and you understand what's going on in that measure harmonically just fine, but you look at the lineup and it's not spelling those chords. Those chords don't exist. Those are ninths and fourths and stuff that, sorry, do that in species counterpoint, and you know Rameau's gonna and JJ Fuchs are gonna be really pissed off at you. So I mean, I think counterpoint is always more expansive than the pedagogical restrictions that it creates. So from that standpoint, I think composers whose structures are complicated and layered and have possibly more than one way of not just analyzing, but really hearing the entire phenomenon, that you can like a complicated book that you can read several times and you get a very different impression each time. Mm-hmm. That's what I think counterpoint is really geared to do, at least, and I think that happens in a lot of music happening now. That's why I still like to teach it if people are willing to sort of knuckle down and go through that discipline.
I think that's an interesting way to consider counterpoint, because you know it is kind of about like synergy between two individual things, and how it's not just two melodies, it's two melodies that are supporting each other and making each other better. And yeah, like the formal aspects, whether it's like more like rhythmic or like the phrase length, or even just like the way that you divvy up different chapters of a piece. Like it seems like there are plenty of opportunities to have sort of like formal elegance in that. And I consider myself kind of an obsessive about form, and I'm curious, basically, if you were to just like give an exercise for a composer to explore form with, and maybe this is putting you on the spot, but do you have any sort of homework that you would give somebody?
I think form. I like Varèse's form formulation. That form is the result of a process, and the process itself, I mean, it can be an abstract process, but given any material, if when a student comes in with an idea, for example, or I have an idea, the questions I have to ask myself are many. I have to find out, what does this material want to do? What can it do? What can it grow into? And exploring that is really finding what its capabilities are. I mean, that's something the material itself has to tell you. I think from the outside, I used to be absolutely diametrically opposed to recapitulation. If I found anything in a piece of mine that looked like recapitulation, I got rid of it immediately. Or anything that was obviously a recognizable recurrence. I mean, to me, that was anathema. It's as bad as having an octave. It's just stay away. Mm-hmm. But I think if the material calls for it, if there's something you can work, some material that you can, if you put it in the context of a form, it can really come out canned and almost surgically horrible. But sometimes the material needs to have something a bit more concrete. And that's really a question of what the composer can do, what the composer wants to do, and what that material's capabilities are. So for me, form is always a question of investigating material. And that's dialectic all the way. That's a dialectical process. That's where I don't teach Marx, but on the other hand, that to me, that's or Hegel, but that's what has to be done. That's where form originates. The period of sort of the fixed forms, either whether we're talking about the medieval and Renaissance forms that were basically poetic and seemed to work out for a while before people started to develop them out of that context, and then the sort of fixed forms of the classic era, they didn't last that long. I didn't go on for that long a period of time. So form is always growing from the material and growing from the context and growing from where the composer is capable of taking it. So I don't have any exercises like that. To me, one of the things I try to do in any teaching situation is to approach things from the standpoint of not just what the student wants to do, but what does the material they've invented want to do? Because I think that's the best way for anybody to look at it. Is don't look at your child as a reproduction of yourself. Look at your child for what your child wants to do, can be, or what it wants to do itself. Learn from it too. And material has a great deal of educational value in and of itself.
Cool.
I'm not meaning to be elusive and
no. This is that's good. I guess with the time that we have left, I just wanted to sort of briefly ask about some of the activism that you do, because I first encountered, I just accidentally closed out of that. I became aware of your work and sort of what you do through Jason Eckhart, and Jason and I have a lot of overlapping interests, in terms of animal welfare, and something that I asked him about and that I wanted to ask you about is basically like, how do altruistic or activist type tendencies feed into creative tendencies? And when we spoke on the phone, you mentioned that you sort of have to have two parallel streams. But is there a way that artists can uniquely contribute to these types of movements, or is there any way that they feed into each other and support each other, or does it just have to be separate? Just curious where your mind goes with that.
Well, I think an artist is a whole person, and your orientation is what you bring to every experience. I mean, there's the technical training you get, but then there's sort of the whole background that you possess, whether it's scientific or literary or whatever it is. For example, I'm for myself, my interests are pretty broad, but sort of my orientation is built in certain channels that are, I would say, have a great deal to do with dialectical materialism and sort of a view of society that is not necessarily far from capitalistic. But I mean, I don't compose anti-capitalist music that is supposed to make people pick up red flags and go marching or anything. Mm-hmm. That's the orientation. That's the way I look at my orientation is going to shine out in that. I gravitate towards, especially poets from Latin America, with a kind of a socialist bent, because I partly not because they're of the socialist bent, because they're the most magnificent poets in South America are all basically Marxists themselves. Pablo Neruda, Roque Dalton, Victor Jara. It's all these really fine writers, and I think most writers probably tend away from the monetization of society and art. But that's just my orientation, the activism part of it. I think, you know, I don't think that I don't think, I think a guy like Cornelius Cardew, for example, got very, very confused with the function of what he was doing artistically, and how turned into somebody who was trying to essentially pander to a class of people who are simply not interested in the philosophical foundation of what he was doing. I mean, they're really sort of two different worlds. The one informs the other for sure. But socially, what I want to do is I want to be active. And for me, activism is not stimulating other people to do things, but to do things myself. I spent years teaching, I don't know, middle and upper class people.
Mhm.
And that's, those are the people who are going to study music, and I'm a musician. And so that's how I did things. But also part of what I've been doing, at least since 1988, was I've been doing things, working with, when I could, in certain contexts in prisons. And as time has gone on, the underserved, that underserved population is something that was very, 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 very much on my mind. There's that whole underserved world is one that I feel, especially going back to when I was younger. I was a leftist student. I marched. I did those things. I'm not into marches. I'm into getting my hands really dirty. I'm not going to sign petitions. I'm not going to have clever bumper stickers. I'm not going to march in parades. I'm going to get my hands dirty. I want to go in and try. I would, if my music could change the world, that would shock me. But that's one of the motivations. So I want to change the way people think in the music that I write. But also, and I'm very committed that way, but I don't want to live in a world where people are constantly saying, well, you can't change the world. Bullshit. You can change the world. If you take the attitudes, you're not going to change the world, then you're not going to change the world. I hear people say, do no harm. What? For them, it means do nothing. And I believe, from activism, I believe in commitment. Jay is committed to animal safety, animal caring, all of that stuff. I mean, that's a big part of his system. He's not a bleeding heart in that regard. He's taking action, and that's what's necessary. I think whatever moves you, jump into it. I'm retired to a considerable extent as a teacher, but that's just, I'm not going to sit down and say, well, I did my job. I'm now working at something that to me is in some respects more important than anything that I've done before, because these are people who nobody ever talks to. They're looked at as completely disposable by society. And once they get locked in that system, if they don't have money and they can't afford a real lawyer, then basically they're going to stay in that system for the rest of their lives. Are they complicit in that? Yes, of course they're complicit in that. But the fact is, it's very, very difficult to break out of that box once you're in it, mainly because there's very, very little support there to do so. There's a lot of things that are on the surface look like they can help you. But I mean, anybody with a felony applying for a job can tell you exactly what's going to happen when their background check is done, and just what their ceiling is going to be, regardless of their intelligence and their talent. And that's something that should be unacceptable in our society. We need to look at ourselves collectively, but also we need to look at the individualities of things instead of sort of trying to prepackage everything. That's where activism, I think, needs to go. Just like music is an individuating thing, I think we need to start looking at people as individuals with capabilities and not judge them in these enormous classifications and try to find that one solution or the one person to blame or something like that. But instead sort of take each person as individual and ask the right questions rather than constantly the wrong ones.
It's kind of funny thinking about how you wanted to sort of punish the audience by putting them in chains, but then meanwhile your place that you sort of make positive impacts is in the incarceration system. So it sounds like you want to
Contradictions are normal. Contradictions are who we are.
So you want to positively impact those sort of underserved communities, but then maybe save the provocation for the concert hall.
I want to make the audience work. The audience society has gotten fat. Well, the audiences have gotten fat up here. I want to make it work. And the fact is, the one consistent fact is prison is a place that infantilizes people because they do nothing there. Because of the fear of people making weaponizing things, a lot of different trade things simply don't exist anymore. You can't work on a car in prison anymore. You can't learn a trade in there because everybody thinks they're going to make a shank. You're going to make some kind of tool, and so people don't learn anything. They get out of prison with very, very little in terms of training and skill, which we should not want that to happen. We should be prepared to accept the risk and go forward that way. But I think that I think challenging people is what it's all about, and providing challenge. It's supporting people to understand that they can meet that challenge, to give people the support they need. Whether you're talking about a student, whether you're talking about an audience that you've got to challenge and prod a little bit, or whether you're talking about a guy who thinks everybody's out to get him and they haven't got a prayer, and you sit there and say, hey, give them a call up this employer. I'll write a letter for you. We'll write my people will write a letter for you. We'll see what we can do. We're not gonna fall at the first hurdle. We're gonna keep pushing. And if people have that kind of support and that kind of challenge, it's amazing what people can accomplish. Not everybody, but I refuse to believe that I refuse to accept the possibility that we can't help if we just roll up our sleeves and keep trying. Some people, yes, the world is filled with failure. Every musician knows about failure and rejection and all that. But I think that helping people to accept that aspect of life is also very important. When somebody is coming out of jail and they feel like a failure, letting them know that they're not a failure, that failure is individual. It's not a social norm. And we can fight social norms by being the individuals we can be.
Very cool. I think I've hit pretty much all the points I wanted to ask you about. Is there anything that you want to talk about before we close out? Anything that you want to promote or anything?
I got a couple premieres coming up in New York City in late October and early November. Check out the International Contemporary Ensemble and the Talk Ensemble websites, and come on out.
Excellent. Cool. Well, Louis, has been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully we can stay in touch.
Okay, John. Thanks very much for having me.
My pleasure. All right. Adios.
Adios.